The first thing I want to mention is that I know this highlights Vesterheim collections, but Vesterheim has a lot of wood carving and acanthus work, but very little of old painted Gudbrandsdal. And so in order to do what we were hoping to do, connect the old with what we're seeing now, I had to really think about where to gather materials and more information. And so I had a lot of help from Judy, who passed on a lot of her information and her teaching materials, as well as comments from Andrea and Jan Norsetter. So I did not do this by myself. I had a lot of help. And of course, Jennifer and Andrew. So just so you know that, so this is a collection of things, and they're all tied together through Vesterheim. So this first picture, why is there a plant? Because this is actually an acanthus plant, which is what much of art since the ancient Greek times has been built on as an inspiration, not just in painting, but in architecture. You'll often see it on the top of pillars and pedestals and things. And if you really look at the leaves, you can see that they're very deeply lobed and pointed, and they really are graceful with their long stem, and they turn, even just one lobe can turn on the whole leaf, or they can be folded in half. There's so many variations. And then the single stalks coming up with the flowers are small and graduated in size, almost geometric, starting with a wider bottom and then a very narrow, small top blossom. So this is basically what the fuss is all about, and translated into painting and carving. So the cupboard on the left on our second slide, whatever, is painted obviously 1817. And I don't know if we have an artist for that one. Put away my notes.
And then I believe that one is Hans Bella.
That's it. Thank you, Andrew. I misplaced my first page of notes. And then on the right, we have Judy Whitker's carved Kogstad. And so how did we get from what's on the left to what's on the right? And Gudbrandsdal painters, both old and new, look to wood carving and nature for their inspiration. So there's a lot of turnovers, and on this cupboard, you can see very narrow scrolls. There's hardly any turnovers. It is also a somewhat monochromatic color scheme, and the carved crown on this cupboard is probably added later. It may not be original to the cupboard. We can move on, Andrew, I think. Okay, so when you're talking the wood carving, which is what many of the Gudbrandsdal painters are inspired by, this particular Tina, on the feet, you can almost see inside. There's two large leaves, and then there's a smaller leaf coming up in the front. So there's depth to it. It's not just a flat one plane. And that may actually be inspired by the flower stalk. And then when we look along the side of it, along the top, you'll see that there's a scroll with a knob, but it doesn't have the circular knob. It has another leaf that is actually turned over. And the tulips that kind of surround that are actually dimensional. So this is what artists, when they're painting, are trying to create, this sense of light, dark, depth, things intertwining and growing just the way nature does. Some more examples of wood carving that are in the museum. The Tina that's at the top is one of my absolute favorites. It's very, very delicate. It's kind of fallen apart. The wood is dry, but it is just a magnificent piece that is so graceful. And it just keeps flowing, the whole thing, even the handle. And then on the bottom, you will see a portion of a mango board that is also carved. These are different from the tina. The tina is an example of Baroque wood carving, whereas these two pieces are more skinny. And these actually look more like the Gudbrandsdal painting that we saw on that first cupboard. So, like the other Rosemaling styles, it depends on what the artist wants to paint. Okay, so an example again, this is on the left is an old panel from a trunk, and you can see the thin scrolls with the blue, very monochromatic, the scrolls themselves. There's very little shading, and there's little bits of like teardrops that are meant to mimic a small leaf or a turnover. And then the flowers are difficult to see on this background, but there are several tulips. And then there's one down at the bottom as well. On the right side, you will see Nils Ellensgaard's interpretation, or painted by Dorothy with Nils Ellensgaard's design. I'm not quite sure about that, but it shows a slightly different tulip. This one actually looks more like the cupboard that we just saw in the beginning of our presentation, with thin scrolls and different colors for the outlining, and it's a little brighter. And the large tulip and the round flowers. So this one is not quite as flowing and lyrical. It doesn't have as much movement as some of the others, but it's still, thank you, Patty. She has a note that it looks like the work of Ole Moen. It does. Okay. Along the way, a teacher from Norway, right now, as far as I know, there are currently no Norwegian painters doing Gudbrandsdal. The last painter that I'm aware of came to Vesterheim in the late 1980s. I think 89 and 92 or something like that. He was here twice, but he also was a guide and a teacher at some of the Vesterheim tours to Norway in the 1980s. And his name is Ragnvald Feistadol. He's primarily known as a wood carver and a metalsmith, but he also paints. And so these two artifacts, the plate and the design thing on the left, are from his classes. This is how he painted Gudbrandsdal, which is different than what we saw from the previous slide. There's a lot of layering in his flowers, and he paints it completely different. It's very subtle in color. And the panel on the left was a class project that he had us do, because I was in that class, that he had us do to learn how to, different ways to do turnovers and leaf shapes. So it was very simple monochromatic scheme. This Kogstad was carved by Hans Sandholm in 1995 or 1996 for the Vesterheim's Migration of a Tradition exhibits. And on the right, you'll see the full back of Kogstad with very definite wide Baroque scrolls and leaves. And then the two big round flowers that are near the top arch. And then there's a close-up of those flowers and some of the scrolls and the leaves and how they twine and curl over on each other. So this is another example of something that the Gudbrandsdal painters might use for inspiration, since we don't have a lot of Gudbrandsdal carving and old painting here. The major influence, a class lesson from slide 7. Got to think about that. This sled is at the museum in Lillehammer at Myhauen. And the person who created it, carved it, made it, and painted it is Jakob Kogstad. And this particular artist is what set Judy Ricker on her journey in Gudbrandsdal. She saw these things while she was there on a Vesterheim tour in the 1880s. I keep going 1880s, sorry, 1990s, and was blown away with it. And so everybody's been taking pictures and bringing them back home. This picture, by the way, is from Jan Norsetter, who spent 1 or 2 days really absorbing the sled. And it is absolutely fabulous. He made the sled, carved the sled, painted the sled. So I wanted you to see the whole sled so you could see how magnificent it really is. But a picture, of course, doesn't do justice. So when Judy was there on the tour, she stayed longer, a couple of days, and spent time at this museum looking at Jakob Kogstad's work. He's considered one of the premier wood carvers and artists of Norway, and he lived in the 1700s. So I think our next picture shows, the middle picture is the front of the sled. And I had to show you this because this blew my mind. All I had ever seen was pictures of the paintings, not the front of the sled. And I love his sense of playfulness in some of the things he does. On the left, you'll see one of the sides of the sled with a little scene, and all that carving is his, including that cross-hatched carving that's down at the bottom there, which is just unbelievable. Notice the lights, the darks, the continuous flow of the scrolls and turnovers. Everything is connected, but you can't find one starting point. Maybe if I spent all day looking at it, but just with a casual look, and it's very monochromatic. The darks are very dark and the lights are very light. So there's a lot of contrast. On the right side, you will see the back portion of the sled. And that also is the same thing. There is a little bit more that you can see a starting point on that one underneath the picture of the stag. So he really loved blues and greens. So on the slide on the left is actually the very front of the sled, the side of the sled. And then next to that, you'll see a painting that Judy Rittker did when she came home and had in her classes that she did, that is inspired by. It's not an exact copy, but it is inspired by. And it's Judy's attempt to paint the light, the dark, the flow of the scrolls, everything that we love about Gudbrandsdal. Here's another side of that sled with a sketch from Judy that she did while she was there. And again, you see you can see how the tip of the leaf turns over, or at the bottom of the sketch of Judy's from the left, it comes in, the leaf is turned over, and then the very tip turns into a scroll knot with all kinds of leaves coming out of it. And you can see similar things inside the sled design. I have to tell you, one of the reasons my painting looks the way it does is because I studied with Judy. And the very first time I saw Gudbrandsdal, I was just blown away. And that was just in a classroom doorway. I signed up for a class because painting my Hallingdal, my line work was terrible. And everybody said Judy had beautiful line work. So I thought, okay, I'll take the class. My parents lived in Milwaukee. I could visit with them while I was doing the class. And I had no idea what this Rosemaling style was. All I knew was Hallingdal, Telemark, Rogaland, a little bit of Oos. So I walked in the door, and this is like just a normal classroom size door. And she had all these sketches and panels propped up on the blackboard across the room. And I just stood there. My mouth dropped open and I was like totally in awe. And there was other people behind me trying to get into the class. And with my bad hearing at that point, I did not hear them. I'm just zeroed in on what I'm looking at across the room at all this beautiful artwork. And I was just blown away. And it hasn't stopped yet. I'm still blown away. Okay, this was a panel that Judy had painted partly for her classes that she used when she was teaching. So she used these panels and sketches when she was teaching Gudbrandsdal at Vesterheim. And again, you can see how the scrolls, how things turn over. And she uses a different color, at least in this panel, to highlight the turnover parts of the leaf, so it's easier to see. It is not that definite in Jakob Kogstad's work. Inside that beautiful sled we saw, there was a sled box, also painted by Jakob Kogstad. And that's on the right, and you're seeing the side of that box. And then on the left, you'll see Judy's attempt for how she is going to do her strokes to create this. And it's very, very obvious in the darks. There's no, well, there was a few turnovers, but they're not very prominent because it's all monochromatic. And this is the top of that same sled box. And if anybody knows what they kept in that sled box, because it's not very big, I'm kind of curious. I've never seen or read anything about what they kept in them. Anyway, on the left is Judy's interpretation of part of that, the corner designs. And on the right is from my book that I published in 2003, A Beginner's Design, that is inspired also by this box. And Judy's and mine are similar, and you can see that we're both using the same design as inspiration, but they're different. And my round flower is very different than what he painted. I was kind of playing with the flowers that I learned how to do when I was in Feistadol's class. Okay, so another prominent Gudbrandsdal painter is Andrea. And she also loves Jakob Kogstad's sled and all the things that we saw on a trip to Norway with Vesterheim. But her Gudbrandsdal is different because she did not study with either Ragnvald Feistadol or Judy Richter. Andrea has a degree in art, and when she first started Rosemaling, she knew nobody, knew no styles, just had seen things and wanted to paint it. So she took a class from the only one that was available when she had time, which happened to be Nancy Schmidt. And the very first project, raw beginner, is the Gudbrandsdal design, which Gudbrandsdal is one of the harder styles to paint, by the way. And she told me she really struggled in that class because she just couldn't see it. And she was determined to learn it. So she went home and basically using her own studies and her art knowledge and her degree came up with this. She just kept looking at it till she came up with it. So these are Andrea's. And her green is one of her favorite color schemes. On this particular slide, on the left, you'll see a fireplace bellows that has some carving and tulips. And on the right, you'll see a print of another piece of Rosemaling. It could be a panel from a door or from a trunk or something. I'm not really sure where it's from, but it's not the original. It's a print of something else. And in the middle, you see Judy's. And the reason I did this is that you can see how different the flowers can be painted and yet still see the inspiration from the Gudbrandsdal flowers and what we paint, the tulips and the round flowers. Okay. Okay, so I don't like the big round flowers because everything in Gudbrandsdal, this is just a personal artistic opinion. So it's not right, it's not wrong, it's just how I feel. And it's kind of what drives how I paint. So the trunk that you are seeing on the left was painted by Erland Kogstad, who was the son of Jakob Kogstad. And his father had very few, if none, flowers in his work. But he did a lot of blue and white and red. So here we see the blue, white, and red influence, but flowers. Beautiful, graceful, flowing tulips. And I really latched onto these. I saw these and I'm like, oh, this fits Gudbrandsdal better than those big round static flowers. So on the left, you will see an example of a beginner's design of me painting a flower inspired by his son. The next two panels are courtesy of Judy and Andrea. On the right is Judy's step-by-step that she would bring for her classes, showing leaves, scrolls, flowers. And then on the left is Andrea's interpretation of how she gets to where she is when she's painting, because that's one of the things that's difficult for beginners with Gudbrandsdal, is that when you start, for example, on Andrea's way up at the top, the second thing with her scrolls, yes, there's just a medium green. And then you add dark green, and then you add some highlights, and then you maybe add a little touch of other colors. So what you start with, say the second number on the scroll, and you end up with the sixth one is completely different. And the same thing with the flowers. You don't get the turnover of the flower petals immediately when we look at the tulips, right, Andrew? So that one is completely flat with a medium value of red. Then you add dark, and you keep adding different things till you end up with the line work on the very bottom. And so that number 2 and number 6 are completely different. And it's the same thing with Judy's. She starts with dark, whereas Andrea starts with a medium value, but each one of us do it slightly different. And it doesn't make any difference how you do it, as long as when you're done, it looks like it is mimicking nature. There's a lot of lyrical flow, overlapping, entwining, dark and light, all those things that make Gudbrandsdal so beautiful and elegant. It's probably the one Rosemaling painting style that is closest to nature. Okay, here's another comparison between Andrea's scrolls and how she works with them and starts them, and my scrolls. Okay, so Jakob Kogstad has been one of the biggest influences for almost all the Gudbrandsdal painters today, starting with Judy. And what you're seeing is a picture of Galatia Church that was completely decorated with either wood carving or painting the entire church. It's like walking into a piece of artwork. This is all done by Jakob Kogstad. He did all the carving, much of the painting. I'm sure he had apprentices that worked with him, possibly even his sons, because one of the beams across the church is dated 1766. So this is not a 6-month project. This was several years in the making. And that carved altarpiece is considered one of the, I don't know, it's one of the treasures of Norwegian folk art in the Stavkirks. And it is really thick, and the holes, and it's so dimensional. You can almost put your hand through the holes that are in that altarpiece. There is so much depth to it. It is just unbelievable. And it's just mind-blowing to stand in this church and just do a 360-degree turnaround, including the ceiling, that it's just everywhere there's art. And the ceiling clouds, by the way, even have turnovers. So this is part of the church pews and the doors that you walk through to get into them. And this is completely different than the Gudbrandsdal, than the sled painting, the designs and flows. And I really love this. And the mangle board on the right is from a class project I did at Vesterheim based on this particular piece of, yes, that church is magnificent. Okay, so I don't know if you can see it, but he actually has animals in those scrolls or leaves. There's no definite scrolls. They're just a pile of leaves. So in the very middle between the two panels framed in white and red, there's a moose. Above that is a bird. And in the two upper corners are also birds in different poses. And then when you come down to the middle on the two very opposite ends, yeah, there is an animal that I'm not quite sure if that's a squirrel, a rat, or a pig. And then on the far right is a sleeping fox. So you can really have fun with this. So I really love doing it because there's just, the sky's the limit. There are no rules, no boundaries, just do it. I love to do this freehand without thinking about it. So that is where our inspiration is coming from. This last trunk, which Jennifer knows, is one of my absolute favorites, and I keep asking. It's from 1781. It actually still has its shipping label on the back of the trunk, and it was shipped by Cunard Lines, and the shipping label says, I think, to North America, and then it names either a city or a state. I think it was Wisconsin. And you're looking at this and saying, well, why is this here? This isn't Gudbrandsdal. Well, it was painted in the Gudbrandsdal Valley by Knut. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Roine, R-O-I-N-E. At least that's what we think. And it's, like I said, it's from 1781. And it's a combination of Gudbrandsdal, the way we know it, and the Rococo, because the scrolls turn in different directions. He's got multiple scrolls as if they're shadows of each other. And the top, the part closest to you, the brightest, is what would be closest to you. And then it goes back and it gets darker and darker and darker till it almost fades into the background. And he's got angels on here, birds on here, animals on here. I keep hoping that they will clean this trunk soon so we can see it in all its glory. And there is the top of the trunk. And also another way that this differs from everything else is that it is a lot more colorful than most of the other Gudbrandsdal that we do and see. It's not monochromatic. Okay, I think I'm done. So if anybody has questions, I will be glad to try and answer them.
Pam, I don't see any pressing questions here in the chat, and you've sort of commented on a few of the things, but yeah, so we just open it up if folks have some questions for Pam.
You're certainly welcome to unmute yourself and ask the question, or welcome to type it into the chat if that works better.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, should I be tapping on that chat button, Andrew, to see the questions?
The chat, currently there aren't any pending questions in the chat right now. The latest update was Patty was sharing that the overlay panel shown earlier was originally on a large cupboard from the Malmshaug in Leisha.
Okay.
Michelle is asking, where is the Jacob Kogstad Sled Museum located? Can you talk a little bit about the Myhaugen?
Yeah, that's Myhaugen in Lillehammer, which I have not yet seen. That is on my bucket list. So
it's a real yeah, it's a fantastic museum and a lovely city right on Lake Musa. So if you get to Norway, I highly recommend heading to that museum. Such a fantastic collection, and Vesterheim owes a lot to that museum for the connection that we have, and many of the pieces that we came were courtesy of the founder, Anders Sandvik, coordinating those gifts to Vesterheim. So
I have a question.
Yes.
Why did they pick the acanthus leaf or tree plant? There was no connection, was there, to that area?
No, but it's an artistic tradition that goes back to ancient Greece. So what happens is they started it for whatever reason, just because maybe it is a graceful thing and you can do so much with it. And then the Romans copied it, and then the rest of Europe copied it eventually from Roman times. And then when the Norwegians would travel, they would see it and use that as inspiration. At least that's my take on it. If somebody has a different answer, you're welcome to chime in.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm one of Eldred Ornston's students, and she always taught us Gudbrandsdal. We really never did much detail work on it. Once we put the highlighted top of the scrolls in, she didn't really show us much with detailing, but a lot of the things that you showed had, detail lines. Was that just Eldred's style?
Some of it might have been Eldred's style. She knew a lot, and she traveled to Norway all the time. So she saw those things back in Norway and then probably did her own translations of them. But this is just personal, I tend to do some of the things that Jakob Kogstad did. And so there's not a lot of detail inside the leaves. However, my very first attempt coming from Hallingdal to Gudbrandsdal was to have these big leaves, and then I'd look at them and say, oh, they're empty. I have to put something inside. So I would fill things up. And I recently saw something from a class I taught in 95 or 96. I didn't recognize it and said, I was in a shop looking at it and I said, oh my God, that has got to be the ugliest Gudbrandsdal I ever saw. And it was mine. It's because you grow as an artist. And what I ended up seeing was that all that line work and that detail took away from the flow of the scrolls. And it's also why I like to do somewhat monochromatic, although I have been challenged by gold medalists in the past. Why don't you do 2 or 3 colors, like the telemark scrolls, for example? But it becomes very difficult to see the flow of things if you're introducing so many colors. And so I think that's one reason it's more monochromatic. But
I saw the church with the Vesterheim tour in 2016, and I probably took 300 pictures in that church alone because Gudbrandsdal is one of my favorite styles. And each one of the panels at the end of the pew, I took them and we took a look at them, and they're beautifully done, but they also don't have a root. So
no, they don't. There isn't even,
I
those
found
church pew panels don't even have a scroll that I've been able to see, because I took the trip in 2014 and Andrea was with me on that trip too, which is interesting. And I remember the two of us just using our camera, the whole keep going, just keep turning 2 inches, and take another picture and another picture of everything in that church.
For sure.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. And there is no, this is from Lynn. Greek mythology, the plant represented immortality. I should be immortal then for all the Gudbrandsdal, the acanthus that I'm painting.
Pam?
Yes.
One thing that I think is important when you point out the panels from the Galatia Church is that everything we saw once we were in the sanctuary had all been restored by Ragnvald Einbüll. And the only original painted pieces were right in the narthex as we walked in on the right-hand side.
Okay, thank you, Patty, because I meant to actually add that it was restored by him and I kind of just forgot.
That's okay. But what's really fun is when you're up before you go into the chancel area, is that on one side there's a self-portrait, and that is original to Kogstad. And then across from there is a portrait that Einbu put in of himself. So they're looking at each other.
I do have pictures of both of those panels, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And it amazes me that, did he completely repaint them or just touch them up? Do you know how extensive it was, Patty?
I think it was quite extensive. He was there for quite a while. And the piece that you see on the left at the top, that is all Rongvald's work. But when you look at the altar, at the carved piece of the altar, when you are standing on the side of it, so you can see front to back, what is up against the wall, that is about 1 meter thick. It's incredible how deep that piece is, how deeply carved it is. It's just stunning, and I'm glad you included that picture.
It's not the best picture. I tried to use my pictures from the trip, but I couldn't. They were not bad, but I couldn't do justice to them, and I couldn't get a full picture. And then when I would try to blow it up, it didn't quite work. And I sent them to Andrew, and we were going to use them anyway. And then he found these two online, and I was really pleased because what I wanted to show you was the splendor of this church, how magnificent the whole thing is. Whether it's Jakob Kogstad's work and inspiration, or Einbu's, or whatever, it's just stunning to be inside of it. Like I said, it feels like you're inside of a living piece of artwork.
And there's a question from Barbara, and she's wondering what colors are typically used for backgrounds.
Mostly what I've shown you has tended to be blues, but there are other colors. Judy uses almost anything she wants. And I remember asking Rongvald Feistadol when I was in his class, and I studied with him twice. He came 2 times. Yeah. They do tend to be monochromatic, but I don't think the specific color of the background is important. You kind of do anything that, to me anyway, if you're going to stay in the traditions, then you use traditional Rosemaling colored backgrounds. I worked with him extensively on doing red on reds. And I even questioned it. I said, well, I'd love to do red on red. It's really bright and cheerful as some Rosemaling colors get anyway. And he said, there's nothing wrong with that. Go ahead. So, okay, he gave me carte blanche to do it. So he worked with me on developing a color scheme for red on red. And yeah, that one is the black on the red with that is metallic gold paint on those yellow turnovers.
There's a question. There are a couple questions.
Yeah, I saw it and it's gone. Can we put that last comment or something back on there, Andrew?
Yep. There were a couple questions about what brushes do you use to paint this style, and do you tend to paint in oils or acrylics primarily?
Okay, so I'm an oil painter, unabashed, unapologetic oil painter. I love the oils for Rosemaling. When I do Swedish, I am now very traditional and do something else, so we won't get into that. But I do oils, and I find it very difficult to use acrylics to get the shading and the values that I want. But I have seen other people do Gudbrandsdal and acrylics, and they do a fabulous job. And for my brushes, when I first started, I was using filberts, and I use a lot of larger filberts because you're filling in large spaces, and I don't want to do 6 strokes. I want to do 1 or 2 because that way I get the flow of the leaf much better without a lot of distracting stroke works. But I have switched in the last 5 years to using almost exclusively round brushes. I get a little nicer shape on the end of the leaves, so I can make nicer points, very similar on my leaves to the top of that sled box that Andrew popped up here on this slide.
And then there are a couple questions about books. One person is asking if you have a recommendation on a good Gudbrandsdal's beginner's book that they could look for. And someone else is asking if your book is still available.
My book is out of print as far as I know. I do have a couple of copies left. I don't actually look at a lot of other people's books, especially in the how-to area. What I look at is I rely on the knowledge I've learned in all of my art classes, whether they be Valdres, Hollingdal, Oos, even a little bit of Rogaland in the beginning, to look at the old things and say, okay, how would I paint that? And then do that way. But when I'm looking for books, I tend to go to some of the wood carving books because what I'm looking for is inspiration for the flow and the design. I'm not so much looking for painting. And that is, to me, that is the most incredible thing. Some of this wood carving, it's just beautiful. I don't have specific titles in mind right now. I'd have to go down and look. I have at least one whole shelf or more of books. Patty, have you got specific titles that you could recommend offhand that are available?
Yes, there's that new Rosemaling from Leisha book put out by the Leisha Historia log, that it's not a how-to, but it's full of wonderful pictures there. There were 3 men who went throughout all of Leisha, kind of what Johann Meyer and Niels Ellingsgaard have done. And they have taken pictures of as many pieces as they could find. And it's just a wonderful book to study from. And it's called Rosemaling from Leisha. And
Do you
maybe
have a copy of it that you could show us?
I do, but I'm not on share.
Okay.
So I can't.
That is my newest favorite book, by the way.
It is mine too. But if Ken can get it for the bookshop, I think anyone who's a serious student of Gudbrandsdal would really benefit from the book.
We would happily pass the title on to him. I'm sure he would be excited to have that tip.
All right, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Any more questions?
There are just more people chiming in and saying that they were also on the 2016 tour and the church was absolutely incredible. Rose is asking how to spell Leisha.
There you go.
Jennifer's got it.
Thank you, Jennifer. I was going to say it. Sometimes it's not how to spell it, it's how to pronounce it.
Yep. Barbara is asking about the book that you and Patty were talking about. Is that in English?
Unfortunately, no. I
Who
wish it
buys
were.
books for words? We just buy books for pictures, don't we, Pam?
Yes, we do. We buy them for the pictures. And I have almost all of my books have those little memo tabs, as Post-it notes, but they're just little skinny strips. Yes, they're sticking out every which way. So one color might be for a certain thing, and then I use another color for something else. And if I run out of space on the side or the top, I will actually even have Post-it notes sticking out of the bottom.
Patty, thank you for holding that up so we can see it.
Yeah, the Google Translate does help, Tina. Thank you. I have used it, and then if I forget, if I haven't used it for a long time, then I forget. So, but sometimes it's really gibberish. Most of the time, you can at least make sense of what they're saying. So, it does help.
A starting place, isn't it?
It is. It is. The next thing I suppose would be to take a language class, either in Swedish or in Norwegian. I think I have enough on my plate.
If somebody wanted to.
The Norwegian, the Swedish, the Russian, and the birds, that's it.